Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and essay grader, and full-length practice exam. You can try it out for free by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Erfun Guela with us today, and I might have pronounced that correctly. We'll find out. And we are going to talk about the hazards of pigeonholing GRE questions. But before then, can you please introduce yourself and your new book?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Erfun Guela. I'm a professional GMAT and GRE tutor. I've been doing it for over 15 years. I have a perfect score in the GRE, and I previously wrote the Guide to the GRE from McGraw-Hill, and I've taken that, adapted it, and published my own book, The Ultimate Guide to the GRE, which you can find on Amazon.
Great, awesome. And yeah, so today we're going to be talking about pigeonholing GRE questions. And what does that mean, first of all?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I say pigeonholing questions, what I mean is the habit of looking at a question, identifying it as falling within a certain category, and immediately assuming that you should just take a certain approach because of the category it falls in. So, as an example, you look at a question, you'll categorize it as a rate question, and you'll feel compelled to immediately use a certain formula or to immediately set up a table because you learn to do that anytime you see a rate question.
Right. And also, basically, it is a common piece of advice that other people give is to tell you to diagnose problems, right? Because oftentimes this is good advice. Um, so where do you kind of draw the distinction, I guess, either between diagnosing problems and pigeonholing, or maybe is it like a a a link that you go into it with and make assumptions kind of before you really know, or like how do you kind of distinguish these two things?
Yeah, well, what you just start out making assumptions before you really know is important. So, the issue with pigeonholing is that it kind of flies in the face of what the exam is designed to measure. The exam is not, if we talk about quant in particular, it is not designed to measure your ability to simply relearn and regurgitate high school math. It's
Yeah.
instead, right, it's designed to address how you're able to implement this foundational knowledge within a reasoning context, part of which largely requires flexibility in how you look at the question. It requires proper goal orientation in ensuring that you identify the most efficient pathway to get to the goal. So, the issue with pigeonholing questions is that you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. You're identifying
Mm.
when you look at a question, say, oh, it's a rate question, I better do X, Y, or Z. You're essentially creating a pathway before really knowing what the actual outcome of that pathway is and whether that's the fastest way to get there. So we ideally you would invert that approach there. Instead of categorizing it as percent, statistics, whatever, what you'll do is read the question high level. The framework I like to give students is threefold. It's understand, plan, execute. You want to understand the situation, understand the givens, understand the goal. You want to plan things out. Okay, well, given what I'm told, given what the goal is, what's the most efficient way to get there? And then you want to do the actual execution. The issue is
Mm.
when you pigeonhole, you kind of start executing immediately. You kind of start doing math because it's available, because it falls into a certain category without being entirely clear on where it's going to take you, without having given yourself a chance to reason the situation. And as a result, what I see with students, two bad things happen. Sometimes they introduce inefficiencies. Sometimes they'll just do a bunch of math and not even know why they're doing it. They're just doing it because they can, because it's available, because they learned that it's going to take them somewhere. And a lot of times they just end up spinning their wheels.
Right. Well, and I mean, I feel like it's hard maybe to not do that, right? Because I mean, certainly the theory designs problems to look one way and go another. But also, you're in a high school situation, you're trying to go as fast as you can. So, what are the ways to like avoid this? I guess.
Yeah, so right, to your point, that's really, it's the temptation is totally understandable, and I empathize with it, and I see it with a lot of students because it is a high stakes exam, it's a high pressure environment, and you want to maximize your time. The thing there that you have to be careful of, and what's counterintuitive, is the way to maximize your efficiency on these questions is to actually slow down at the beginning of the question. For most people, they just feel this compulsion to go, go, go. Again, going back to pigeonholing, like say, okay, it's a percent question. I'm just going to use this formula or whatever and see what happens. And
Mhm.
when you take that approach, again, you haven't fully processed the situation. You're not being fully goal oriented. And what ends up happening if we consider the understand, plan, execute framework, the execution ends up taking a lot longer because you identify suboptimal pathways. So
Mhm.
to maximize time efficiency, we actually want to slow down at the beginning, process the situation properly, and really take time in that planning stage. Think through, okay, what can I do, right? Maybe, yes, I've categorized this as an average question, but do I actually need this table? Is there maybe a faster way of getting there? Can I maybe plug in numbers? Whatever the case may be, give yourself a chance to be flexible, identify different pathways to get to the goal, then worry about doing the action.
Yeah, I mean, do you recommend that people try to find speed pathways for every question just to make sure, or is that kind of a waste of time? It's more just be thoughtful.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance there. When you see a pathway, and this is partly, when you're preparing, you have to ask yourself these questions. What I recommend to students is, okay, you might see a pathway. You have to be honest with yourself about whether you think that pathway is going to get you to the answer within 2 minutes. Because a lot of times the answer there is, if you're honest with yourself, the answer is no. And if that's the
Right.
case, then yeah, you absolutely should give yourself a chance to identify a different pathway. Now, another component of that is just when doing homework, when reviewing questions, don't be result oriented. Don't say, "Oh, I got it right, cool, let me move on." Instead, be process oriented. Review it and ask yourself, "Okay, I did it a certain way. Was there an alternate pathway available that may have been more efficient?" The more you do that as you
Right.
actually study, the more you'll internalize that for testing.
Would you recommend then, like, this is just an example that I just thought of, but like maybe you answer all your questions like the first time, and then you go back through and you try to answer them all using a different method just to see? Like, is that just an outrageous idea, or is there some validity to it?
I mean, I actually don't think that's an outrageous idea. I would recommend just doing it as like I like to have students do questions one at a time and then review them. But the way you're framing it is similar. I mean, you're not going to be guaranteed to find a different pathway, but giving yourself that opportunity is really important. Even what can I do with my students? At periodically, I have them go back and review questions they missed. Like, obviously, that's a big
Mhm.
part of the whole. But what I mean is, like a month down the line, let's say they haven't done fractions in a while, I'll have them go back and review some fractions questions, and ask them, okay, when you're reviewing this, give yourself a chance to identify every pathway available.
Right.
That has to be sort of an instrumental part of the study process.
Right. Got it. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think just you you want to both avoid, trying to solve the question the wrong way, and also just like trying to solve the question in a slow way. 'Cause both are not great,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the tricky balance. I mean, it's obviously like being accurate is great, but it's from there. If you get a question right in 4 minutes, you didn't really get it right because on the real thing, I mean, that's just gonna essentially sabotage your score. The other thing students need to be aware of, right, when they get into this habit of categorizing, pigeon-holing, and consequently taking inefficient approaches, is that they'll introduce more steps than are necessary. And yes, that's going to eat into your time, but just as importantly, it's going to introduce more steps, which means a higher likelihood of silly mistakes. And the way
Right.
GRE scoring works, silly mistakes are basically going to kill your score. And I'd say that's as important as the time you lose. So, yeah, that's another sort of downstream consequence of that.
So then, like, I guess two questions. First off, when you're in the studying phase and you catch yourself doing this, or you realize that you did it kind of after the fact, like, how do you correct that behavior? And then the same question, but like, what if you're like on the real GRE and you're kind of like 2 minutes into a problem and you realize that you totally went the wrong route and now you're kind of in trouble with that problem?
Okay, so first question: when you're studying, how do you like better internalize the ability to identify different pathways?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, part of it is make sure you don't just do your homework by concept. In other words, if some people break up their homework and say, okay, I'm only going to do fractions week one, I'm only going to do percents week two, I'm only going to do ratios wherever week three. And if you break it up that way, that's just going to really reinforce the habit of pigeonholing. Because that's all you're ever going to be doing on any question, the way you're doing it. So, my recommendation, it's okay to do questions that refer to a certain topic. I mean, it's definitely important to say, okay, I'm going to do fractions in a given week, but concurrent with that, I do recommend doing questions across the board from all topics as well to ensure that you're not just looking at it from the lens of how am I going to implement a certain concept, but also just how am I going to think of the question from a higher level.
Right. Okay.
And then as far as your question on the real thing, I mean, if you find you're 2 minutes into a question, you're not making any progress, I hate to say it, but you should probably be just ditching that question at that point. I mean, you only have 2 minutes to answer the question. If you spend 2 minutes and you're not making progress, that means it's probably a hard question. Missing it probably won't hurt you as much as some of the easier questions. So you want to make sure you save that time so that you're able to answer the question.
Right. Well, and it's also like it's too like you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to like throw out the rat.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I tell students, if a question is giving you that much difficulty, it's probably objectively a hard question. And the way the scoring
Yeah.
works, the missing harder questions hurts you less than missing easier questions. So to your point, yeah, we want to ensure that we save that time for the questions we know how to do. And unfortunately, the GRE, the question difficulty is just totally random, essentially within a given section. So you might see a level 5 early on, and if you waste 5 minutes on that, that might be time that you won't have available for a level 2 later.
Right. Well, and this is general advice, but like you can skip questions in the GRE. It's one of the best things about it compared to the GMAT. So you could do that if you're not sure, just skip it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And that if the worst case happens and you are 2 minutes in and then you skip it, like you can always just come back later.
Yeah, if the time is available. I recommend to students is in a case like that, like don't plan to come back to it. Take advantage of that time on what the rest of the questions. But if you do have that time, go.
Yeah. Well, great. Anything else about pigeonholing questions that you wanted to make sure we covered today?
The last thing I'll say, there's this cycle. So within psychology, there are these things called cognitive biases. The one that most of us are familiar with is the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to seek out information that confirms your beliefs. There's a lesser known one called the commission effect, which basically states that there's this erroneous belief that when we're doing something, we're by definition making progress. And I think this is
Mm.
really applicable to this idea of pigeonholing and to just GRE Quant generally. What I find with a lot of students who tend to pigeonhole and categorize is when they look at a question, by it's kind of psychologically comforting to categorize it and to just rigidly apply a formula because you feel like you're doing something and you're moving forward. But you need to ask yourself, be honest with yourself, okay, is this formula actually taking me anywhere? Do I really know why I'm doing it? And if the answer is
Right.
no, put the pen down and think it a little more.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Zeri Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Erfun Guela from GRE Compass. And Achievable has a great online GRE course. You can try it for free by going to achievable.me.